Thank you for coming to my talk, Losing the Ruby Accent and Writing Fluent Crystal. My name is Seth. Just a quick introduction before we get started. I'm a Crystal language ambassador. My background has been primarily in Ruby and production for the last 5 years, using Crystal for about the last 2.5 years, mostly in side projects, but recently also in production. I'm the current maintainer of the Amber framework. And as I mentioned here, I work for a company called NoInc, where it's primarily a Rails monolith for our product, where we actually serve the US and part of Canada's election infrastructure for voter registration. And so I've had the fortunate pleasure of introducing Crystal to that process. So let's go over a quick agenda. What exactly is the Ruby accent, right? We're going to define that. We're going to define that from the perspective of a developer, and I'm going to give you a couple of tips. These tips are really geared toward and aimed towards people who are brand new, first discovering the Crystal language. So if you're already experienced, you probably are going to pick up on these pretty intuitively at this point. I'm also going to leave some tips for people who are shard makers or maintainers, whether you're starting something new or you're maintaining something that's existing. I've got some advice that I can give that is a little different from how they do it in the Ruby world. So if you're coming from there and you have an open source experience and you're an experienced developer, this will hopefully help you with the Crystal ecosystem. And then I've got a nice little announcement at the end. So let's get started by defining what exactly is the Ruby accent. Well, it's when a developer builds a Crystal app as if it were Ruby, expecting things to work the same. But get it, they're pretty similar, they look very similar, but they're not the same, contrary to what the meme says. All right, so tip number 1 is don't be lazy with nil. Now, in Ruby, ampersand, it's everywhere. I'll show you in a code sample after this, but in Ruby, you just don't care. You don't worry about nil until the very end, when maybe you go to render a view or you try to do a final calculation. Then you might actually check for nil and you might do something. But throughout your process flow, you can ignore it. But in Crystal, that's the opposite. You actually want to get rid of nil as early on as possible. So generally, when you've got an application, the outer edges of your application where data is coming in is when you're going to experience nil. And that's when you want to validate it and do something with it to transform to try and avoid it. Otherwise, it can lead to some pretty messy code. So consider yourself marked safe from nil now. Here's the code example, right? So this is a pretty straightforward Ruby method. We have my method, we have double splat with the args. That turns keyword arguments into a hash in case anybody doesn't know. And here we're transforming the keys. This is totally arbitrary, turning them into a string and uppercasing them, and then we're returning that hash, right? So in this example, we've got my method, we call it with some keyword arguments, and it returns the hash that we're expecting. But we can also call it without any arguments, and it returns nothing, and in Ruby, you don't care. So if you try to do this in Crystal, you end up with kind of a crystallized Ruby, where you still have an almost identical method, right? We have my method, we have the double splat. If you tried to compile it, you'll find out really quickly that you can't transform the keys because you have a named tuple, which sounds like a completely foreign concept the first time you run into that, being a Ruby developer. But you'll probably really quickly figure out the 2H and the transform keys, and this works. However, you get some unpredictable behavior if you try to use this method without any keyword arguments. You still get a hash, but you can see that the type here for the value is a no return. And this is where you start getting some pain trying to treat Crystal like it's Ruby, because now you're going to have to start adding in things like conditionals or other things to check and see what's going on with the value. You'll probably have some frustrating experiences with the compiler. So the answer to that is, let's do it the Crystal way. We're going to write a second method. So we're looking at this. You still have the original my method. We haven't done anything. We haven't changed it at all. But now we've got the second my method that takes no arguments. So in this example here, you can see we still have the original my method I called with keyword arguments, but we also have the my method there. And I've noted that this time we're returning a hash that has the types that we want defined that match our other method. This is going to be that no matter how you use this, you're going to get a consistent type that's returned, which is going to reduce the complexity of all of your code that comes after using this method, because now you don't have to account for varying types. Now, this looks really funny coming from Ruby, and I try to explain method overloading. We usually get looks like this. Funny story is when I first started learning Ruby, it originally learned Java, so overloading to me was normal, and I had a really hard time wrapping my head around the fact that you can only write a method once, and that's somehow supposed to handle every type. That's usually a funny conversation when introducing Crystal to a Rubyist. Okay, so next tip is about monkey patching. Just don't do it. Don't do it. I'm joking a little bit. It can be helpful. It's helpful when you're troubleshooting, but you don't want to build features on top of monkey patches. Okay, if you're trying to monkey patch something in order to build behavior, you should really rethink your pattern. But it's extremely helpful that if you're getting behavior that's unexpected from something, then go ahead and try a monkey patch, see if you can adjust it. And when you come up with a fix, make sure you make a PR with the changes so that it can be merged and you can eventually get rid of that monkey patch and you're not relying on it. All right, number 3, standard library first. Ruby standard library is almost completely undocumented. More than half of it is still undocumented, depending on how you define documentation, but for the most part, it's quite the mystery. However, Crystal's standard library is robust. And I've got a really good example of that here. If you're a Rails developer, you know the blank method. Well, blank isn't available outside of Rails because that's a feature that was added onto the language through active support monkey patching. However, in Crystal, the blank method is part of the standard library, so you don't have to be using a framework in order to make this functionality work. So now, what's this Ruby accent as a shard maker, right? This one's funny. The code documents itself. This is probably one of the biggest lies we've sold ourselves over time. I never remember what my code is 6 months later. So the fact that it documents itself, but I have to go reread a novel, it's not as productive as writing good documentation. So please write documentation. And then I already touched on this, but recreating or enhancing behavior of the standard library. Don't do it. That's not what shards are for. Shards should be for adding behavior that's beyond the standard library for a specific purpose. Give it a boundary, but don't try to enhance the standard library, but through monkey patching or some kind of strange extension. If you have a feature that you think is valuable, please open an issue so that we can try to discuss it, maybe include it and everybody can get a benefit, and then it's less maintenance for an individual. And then I just like memes. All right, so some tips about code documentation and behavior. Use the documentation tool. We have one. It's built into the language. It's beautiful. It's a very simple command. When you're writing documentation, do the reader a favor and state the level of expertise you expect them to have, or at least some ideas of concepts of knowledge. So if you're writing about something in particular that's meant to be used a certain way, and you've created a tool that's a little bit more sophisticated than, say, you want to aim to explain things so that at least an intermediate developer can understand. But ideally, if a junior stumbles across it, they can at least know they're in over their head before they get in over their head and end up opening issues and being frustrated. Bonus points if you can link to some resources to help people get up to speed before they use your shard. Try to avoid tight coupling with shards. So this is the next code example that I'm going to go into after this. This is not an issue in the Ruby world, just due to the nature of it being interpreted. But when things are typed, you have to have these types available at the time that you're testing and working on it. And it has to be declared in advance. So if you have a feature that, say, relies on database functionality or some type of client that you need, which is the example I'm going to use, you might need it in development, but you ultimately want to design it to not require that a single resource. We're going to use this with abstract classes. And by the way, just the final tip, please use releases. I have a lot of shards that we run into where we're all just using the master branch or the main branch, depending on how old the repo is. It leads to breaking changes getting merged and people's projects getting ruined, and it decreases the trust and the stability of the project that you're working on. So please do your best to use releases and at least have someone on the repo help you with maintaining that. Don't feel like you have to do everything on your own. All right. Let's look at this code example now. This is an abstract class. This is a class that goes in and sits as a placeholder, right? It defines a class that we don't actually use directly, but it also outlines some methods with the parameters that we're expecting for behavior. Now, these are placeholder methods, and these are what you would build your app around. So let's look at how we would inherit from this and use it. This is a really simple example. I called it a Redis client, and I kind of lied because it's actually using a hash. That's things you can get away with sometimes. But this is a really simple example. We're inheriting from our abstract class. We're redefining the methods that we've put in that were placeholders and actually giving them the behavior that we expect them to have. So then in this next way over complicated example here, the only point that really matters is looking at the line number 2, where we initialize this my demo app. You can see here that we have it typed to our abstract class. But really what would happen is when we do myDemoApp.new, we would pass in the myRedis client class that we've created here, a new instance of that. And that would be acceptable. The compiler would look at that. It would understand that because when we built our libraries in the abstract class, it would know to look for the methods that we need. It would look for the types that need to be returned properly, and we can go on our merry way. We're not tied to any one specific resource. Okay. All right. So now that I've probably talked way too fast for everybody, made sure I left plenty of time for questions. I'm going to unveil a little announcement. All right. Using Crystal and Ruby together just got even easier. I know. Surprising. The Fruit Juice gem now supports legacy Ruby going back to 2.5. So what the heck is Fruit Juice? A lot of people probably don't know about it, and that's okay. Fruit Juice is a gem that I wrote that allows you to enqueue background jobs from Ruby into Mosquito, which is a Crystal background processor. The idea here came from a project that we have in production where we have really long data intense, memory and calculation intense background processes that run. And we've been looking for ways to optimize those. Some of them can easily take 4 to 6 hours. So we were trying to look for a way of, well, we only have a background job. How do we integrate this into our stack? We primarily have a monolith. We don't really want to do microservices. How do we give the sense of and feeling of this monolith in our project while still getting some benefits? So Fruit Juice gives you a very sidekick-esque way to define classes and then trigger a background job. And then this gives you a nice seamless way. So if you're using Redis, you don't have to deploy the same cluster. You get a lot of flexibility. Or if you're following the Majestic Monolith approach from a Rails app and you're trying to figure out how to introduce Crystal, this gives you an avenue to start doing that and maybe, use a strangler fig pattern to try and wrap your Rails app and get performance where you need it without necessarily doing a full rewrite. All right. And that's it. These are some places that you can find me. This link here is to the Amber Discord. I'm pretty active in it. Try to be on there every day, answering questions, help anybody out if they have any questions or if they're interested in anything. Big shout out and appreciation to the people who have been volunteering lately and making contributions. I really appreciate it. This talk, I have more code examples in more breadth. I use the comment tool like I recommend here in the repo. And if you want, you can also check out my site. I post maybe a couple times a year. So if you're interested in very infrequent writings, but hopefully something thoughtful, check it out there. And you can always at me on Twitter, which X, but you know what I mean. Okay, I have the Discord on my phone, so I'm gonna bring this up and see if there's any questions in here. Yes, George, make sure to use releases in your shard YAML. Yes.
So
I did. I talk really fast and from the Northeast. Hopefully everybody understood that though.
yeah, it was clear. It was really nice work, man.
Excellent, thank you. I see some people typing, just making sure I give everybody a chance if they have any questions in the Discord. I can't see the YouTube one, so if you have them, please shout them out or type them in the chat, and maybe I should check the chat.
No, we don't have questions so far. I have a request. This is from me. We really need that blog post about Mosquito and using Crystal and Ruby.
You're faded out a little bit there. You need a blog post about what?
About Mosquito and and using Ruby and Crystal together?
Oh yeah, sure. I can follow up. I plan to make a demo app, and since we have some time to talk about some of the things that we've been working on, as part of that and part of filling in kind of this whole losing this accent thing and knowing the differences between the language, Crystal didn't get too much exposure in terms of having content written when ChatGPT was trained, because it was trained 2 years ago. One of the things that I've been working on is actually coming up with a process so that we can join as shard makers and maintainers and create training material and then fine tune our own model that can then be used and utilized through a VS Code plugin. The idea here is not necessarily to couple it with ChatGPT, but it creates training data that we can then feed to any model and that people can then use and can help, and you will have up-to-date, accurate tooling available with the help of AI, which should really decrease the barrier of entry for people coming in and getting to know Crystal the first time. That's part of what updating this gem was about.
Awesome. Any more questions?
Cool. I don't see any questions coming in, but thank you for the kudos, everybody.